Let me ask you something personal. Think about the most significant relationship in your life: a partner, a best friend, a parent, someone whose absence would leave a shape in your daily existence, a specific, unmistakable hole that nothing else fills the same way. Now hold on to that feeling for a second, because the question we're exploring today is whether an ancient human, a person living 50,000 years ago, hunting animals across a landscape without roads or cities or any of the infrastructure we use to organize our social lives, could feel the same thing. Not just the biological drive to reproduce, not just proximity and convenience, but actual attachment, preference for a specific individual, grief when that individual was gone. The kind of bond that makes you do something irrational, like drag flowers to a grave for someone who can no longer see them. Did ancient humans have relationships? And I don't mean did they mate? Obviously they mated. You're here. The entire species is here. That part clearly worked. I mean, did they fall in love? Did they choose specific people and stay with them? Did they mourn? Did they feel jealousy and longing and the specific quiet comfort of having someone who knows you completely? Did they lie awake next to someone in a cave 40,000 years ago and think, even without the words for it, I don't want to lose this person? The answer is yes. Profoundly, demonstrably, scientifically, yes. And the evidence for it is written in bones, in genetics, in neurochemistry, and in a handful of archaeological discoveries that are, once you understand what they actually mean, almost unbearably moving. Let's start with the biology. The first thing you need to understand is that the emotional experience of attachment didn't begin with modern humans. It didn't begin with Homo sapiens or even with primates. The neurological machinery that generates bonding is genuinely ancient, old enough that calling it a human invention would be laughably inaccurate. The key player is oxytocin. You've probably heard of it. It gets called the love hormone in popular science coverage, which is both accurate and a massive understatement of what it actually does. Oxytocin is a neuropeptide, a small signaling molecule produced in the hypothalamus, a structure deep in the brain. Its evolutionary history, traced by researchers in a study published in Communications Biology, stretches back at least 540 million years to the emergence of the first vertebrates. The receptor for oxytocin appears across a staggering range of species: fish, reptiles, birds, mammals. The specific bonding function of oxytocin in social behavior is conserved across hundreds of millions of years of animal evolution. What this means is that when oxytocin floods your brain during physical contact with someone you love, you are running a neurochemical program that predates the dinosaurs. But oxytocin doesn't operate alone. It works in combination with dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with reward, pleasure, and motivation, and vasopressin, a hormone that plays a documented role in what researchers, in a phrase that is both scientific and deeply relatable, describe as mate-guarding behaviors. In plainer terms, vasopressin is involved in jealousy. The neurological architecture of "I don't want anyone else near this person I've bonded with" is a real, measurable, biological phenomenon with its own dedicated chemical pathway. Research published in the journal Biology, led by Sarah Blumenthal and Larry Young at Emory University, mapped the neurological stages of pair bonding in detail. Oxytocin and dopamine interact to link your neural representation of a specific person, their face, their voice, their particular way of being, with the brain's social reward circuitry. The result is a selective attachment, not just a generalized positive feeling toward humans, but a specific, irreplaceable association with one individual. And here's the part that matters for our question. That brain, that chemistry, that neurological architecture capable of selective, long-term, jealous, grief-producing attachment. Ancient humans had it. Not a simplified version of it, not a proto-version of it. The same functional system, running in the same neural structures, producing the same cascade of bonding hormones, in a brain that was, in all the ways that count for this discussion, anatomically identical to yours. The capacity for deep, specific attachment was not something modern civilization invented. It was something evolution built into the primate brain long before our species existed, and then we arrived with it already installed. But biology alone doesn't answer the question completely. Lots of animals have oxytocin systems and pair bonding behavior. The more interesting question, the specifically human question, is what ancient relationships actually looked like in practice. Did ancient humans stay together? Did they choose partners deliberately and maintain those partnerships over time? Or was it something looser, more fluid, more purely situational? This is where the fossil and genetic evidence becomes genuinely fascinating. Let's go to Russia in 1955, a site called Sunghir, about 200 kilometers northeast of Moscow. Archaeologists excavating there uncovered a series of burials dating to approximately 34,000 years ago. Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens, modern humans in every anatomical sense, living in what is now central Russia during the last ice age. What they found was extraordinary on multiple levels. The burials were lavish in a way that has no functional explanation. The individuals had been interred with thousands of mammoth ivory beads. One adult male was covered in what researchers estimate to be around 3,000 beads that would have taken hundreds of hours to produce. Two children were buried head-to-head in the same grave, each also covered in elaborate ornaments, with a long carved ivory lance and a human femur filled with red ochre placed between them. This is not survival behavior. This is not the behavior of a species focused purely on immediate practical needs. This is ceremony. This is people investing enormous amounts of time and labor into honoring specific individuals after death, which only makes sense if those individuals mattered in a way that extended beyond their living utility to the group. But the truly stunning detail came decades later, when researchers finally had the technology to sequence the complete genomes of the Sunghir individuals. Published in the journal Science in 2017, the genetic analysis led by Professor S.K. Willerslev of Cambridge and Copenhagen revealed something nobody had quite expected. The individuals buried together, including the two children buried in the same grave, head to head, surrounded by shared grave goods, were not closely related. At most, they were second cousins. The adult femur placed in the children's grave likely belonged to someone no closer than a great-great-grandparent of the boys. Stop and let that register. A hunter-gatherer community living in Ice Age Russia 34,000 years ago in small bands where everyone would have known everyone personally, was deliberately choosing mates from outside their immediate family group. They were not just accidentally avoiding inbreeding through dispersal. The genetic evidence indicates intentional, organized partner selection across social groups, a network of relationships deliberately structured to maintain genetic diversity. The ornamentation is incredible, Willerslev noted, and there is no evidence of anything like that with Neanderthals and other archaic humans. When you put the evidence together, it seems to be speaking to us about the really big questions. What made these people who they were as a species, and who we are as a result? These weren't people drifting through casual, interchangeable social contact. They were people who had developed systems, possibly accompanied by rituals, ceremonies, and social rules we can only partially reconstruct, for choosing partners, establishing relationships, and maintaining the bonds between separate groups through the deliberate exchange of mates. That is, functionally, a relationship culture. Now let's talk about what love looks like when you can't speak it. Because one of the most powerful pieces of evidence for genuine emotional attachment in ancient humans doesn't come from genetics or burial goods. It comes from the bones of people who shouldn't have survived. This is a field called the bioarchaeology of care, and it does something remarkable. It identifies in ancient skeletal remains evidence of individuals who lived with severe disabilities or injuries that would have been fatal without sustained support from other people. And then it asks, who provided that? Support. And what does that tell us about the bonds those people had? The case of Shanidar I is one of the most discussed in the literature. Found in Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan, this Neanderthal individual, not even a modern human, pushing the timeline back to at least 45,000 years ago, was a male who died at approximately 50 years old, which was itself unusual. He had sustained an amputation or loss of function of his right forearm at some point in his life. He had significant trauma to the left side of his skull that likely affected his vision. He had a severe limp, and bone growths in his ear canals indicate that he had major hearing loss, possibly approaching deafness. He survived all of this for years, possibly decades, in an environment containing active predators. Hunting communities don't carry dead weight. The common assumption has always been that prehistoric life was governed by ruthless practicality, that people who couldn't contribute were abandoned. Shanidar I was not abandoned. Someone fed him, someone protected him, someone slowed down for him, compensated for his hearing loss in situations where that deafness would otherwise have been a death sentence in open savanna. More than his loss of a forearm, bad limp, and other injuries, his deafness would have made him easy prey for the ubiquitous carnivores in his environment and dependent on other members of his social group for survival, said anthropologist Eric Trinkhaus of Washington University. Was that someone a partner? A close friend? A family member in the broadest sense? We can't say with certainty. What we can say is that someone cared enough about this specific individual to provide sustained, costly, years-long support that had no practical return. Then there's Romito II, found in a cave in southern Italy, dating to around 10,000 to 12,500 years ago. A young person, initially identified as a teenage female, though the sex classification has been debated, with a severe form of acromesomic dysplasia, a condition that would have caused dramatically shortened forearms and significantly restricted physical function. The community at Romito were hunters. Their survival depended on the physical ability to chase, track, and kill large animals. Romito II could not have done any of that. They lived anyway, fed, sustained, and kept alive by people who didn't have to do it. There is a 7,500-year-old boy in Florida known as Windover Boy who survived to around age 15 with a severe spinal malformation called spina bifida that would have prevented independent walking. His survival required years of care from other people. These cases aren't isolated curiosities. When researchers survey Paleolithic burials specifically for evidence of disability and care, they find both at surprisingly high frequencies. Ancient hunter-gatherer communities were, routinely, keeping alive members who offered no immediate practical benefit to group survival. That is not policy. That is not strategy. That is emotional attachment-producing behavior that defies pure self-interest. That is what love does. And then there is the question of grief, which might be the most intimate evidence of all. Grief only exists where attachment existed first. You cannot grieve a stranger. The depth of grief is a direct measurement of the depth of the bond that preceded it, which means that evidence of grief in ancient humans is, simultaneously, evidence of the relationships that made grief possible. The flower burial of Shanidar Cave is one of the most debated and one of the most haunting pieces of evidence for Neanderthal emotional life. Shanidar IV, another individual from the same cave, was found with clusters of ancient pollen concentrated in the sediment around the body, representing several specific flower species. The original excavator, Ralph Selecki, interpreted this as deliberate flower placement by mourners, the physical act of bringing blooms to a grave. The interpretation has been contested. Critics have argued the pollen could have been deposited by burrowing rodents, or by wind, or by later contamination. The debate has continued for decades, but a more recent excavation at the same site, published in 2020 in the journal Antiquity, discovered a new Neanderthal individual, Shanidar Zede, in close proximity to the original cluster, with well-preserved plant material in the sediment around them. Emma Pomeroy of Cambridge, lead author of the study, noted that the evidence for deliberate burial was strong and that what mattered was the intentionality behind it. If more is done, it indicates more complex, symbolic, and abstract thinking, compassion, and care for the dead, and perhaps feelings of mourning and loss. Feelings of mourning and loss. In Neanderthals. In individuals who were not even Homo sapiens, let alone modern civilized humans. The evidence for grief doesn't stop there. Burials across the Paleolithic record show elaborate, time-consuming care for the dead that far exceeds what's necessary for simple corpse disposal. Bodies positioned carefully, grave goods placed deliberately. Red ochre, a material associated throughout prehistory with ritual and symbolic significance, spread over remains. The two Sungheer children buried head-to-head, covered in thousands of painstakingly made ivory beads, with objects placed as if for a journey. None of this is practical. All of it is emotional. These are the actions of people who cannot simply move on, who feel compelled to do something, even something symbolic, even something the dead person cannot perceive, because the alternative is to do nothing, and doing nothing is unbearable. That is grief. And grief, as any psychologist will tell you, is love with nowhere to go. Here's where it gets particularly interesting and slightly uncomfortable for anyone who wants a simple answer. What ancient human relationships were structurally, whether they were monogamous, polygamous, or something else entirely, is genuinely contested among anthropologists. And the honest answer is it varied enormously across populations, environments, time periods, and cultures. The human pair bond has evolutionary deep roots. Computational models examining primate social structures suggest that some form of relatively stable male-female partnership emerged in our lineage at least partly because human infants are extraordinarily demanding. A human baby is helpless for longer than the offspring of virtually any other species. It requires years of intensive care before it can function independently. Supporting a child of that dependency level while also foraging, hunting, and maintaining the broader social group is significantly more manageable when the burden is shared between two dedicated caregivers. The pair bond, in this view, evolved at least partly as a cooperative childcare strategy. But pair bond doesn't necessarily mean strict, exclusive monogamy by modern cultural standards. Modern hunter-gatherer societies, which give us our best window into how prehistoric humans actually organized their social lives, show enormous variation. Some practice sustained pair bonding with high fidelity. Some have structured polygamous arrangements. Some have more fluid, community-oriented approaches to childcare and partnership. There isn't one universal prehistoric relationship model. What is consistent across the evidence is the presence of genuine preference, selectivity. The choosing of specific individuals as significant others, romantic partners, deeply bonded friends, committed co-parents, in a way that goes beyond generic social proximity. Ancient humans weren't just bonding with whoever happened to be nearby. The Sung-Hear evidence alone tells us they were crossing significant social and geographic distances to find specific partners. They were making choices. And choices in relationships are what separate attachment from convenience. There's one more piece of the puzzle that deserves attention, and it connects back to something almost philosophical. The question of whether ancient humans had real relationships sometimes gets muddled by a subtle form of condescension. The idea that emotional depth requires cultural sophistication, that feelings become more genuine as civilization becomes more complex. That ancient people had instincts where we have emotions, drives where we have love, proximity where we have commitment. This is not supported by the evidence. The neurochemistry is the same. The brain structures are the same. The behavioral evidence, care for the disabled, elaborate grief rituals, deliberate partner selection across social networks, the sustaining of individuals who offered no practical return, all of it points to the same conclusion. In fact, some of the most intellectually honest researchers in this field have made the opposite argument that the relationships of ancient humans may have been in certain ways more intense than modern ones, not less. When your social world is a band of 20 to 50 people and the landscape outside that band is genuinely dangerous, the bonds within it carry more existential weight. Every person you love is someone whose absence you cannot compensate for with distance, with distraction, with the numbing breadth of a city full of strangers. Loss is immediate and total in a way that modern life rarely replicates. When Shanidar I lost the use of his forearm and his hearing and his vision in one eye, the people who chose to keep feeding him and protecting him weren't doing it out of abstract altruism. They were doing it because he was someone they knew completely, someone who had been with them through seasons and hunts and births and deaths, someone specific and irreplaceable in the only world they had. That's not a proto-relationship. That's not a primitive approximation of the real thing. That is the real thing. So, did ancient humans have relationships? Yes, with everything that word implies. They fell for specific people and not for others. They stayed, they sustained, they grieved when those people were gone in ways that couldn't possibly be explained by practical necessity. They built social systems to connect themselves with partners from beyond their immediate circle, and then they buried those partners with thousands of handmade ornaments and flowers and the kind of careful, unhurried attention you only give to someone who meant everything. They felt jealousy because vasopressin made sure of that. They felt the comfort of consistent presence because oxytocin rewarded every moment of closeness with the same ancient neurological signal it's been sending for 540 million years. This matters. Hold on. Don't let go. The gap between them and us is not a gap in emotional depth. It's a gap in vocabulary, in institutions, in the accumulated cultural technology for naming and formalizing what the nervous system has been doing since long before we had the words for it. An ancient human looking at a partner across a firelit cave 40,000 years ago didn't have the word love. But the chemistry flooding their brain when that person walked into their field of view was identical to yours. The feeling came first. We just eventually found a word for it.